The air inside the ancient walls of Windsor is usually thick with tradition and the quiet hum of history, but on this particular evening, it felt heavy with something far more dangerous. Just 5 minutes before Princess Anne's high-profile event was set to begin, as the crystal chandeliers flickered to life and the first notes of ceremonial music echoed through the halls, a silent execution was taking place behind the scenes. It was not a physical confrontation, nor was it a public scandal. It was something far more clinical, far colder, and infinitely more revealing. Names were vanishing. Invitations that had been hand-delivered to the most exclusive social circles of London were suddenly, without warning, being rendered worthless. These were not just any guests. They were the heartbeat of Queen Camilla's private world, the loyalists who had spent years navigating the corridors of power under her patronage. But as they approached the final security checkpoints, the smiles of the guards did not meet them. Instead, there was a chilling pause, a consultation of a revised digital registry, and then the words that would send shockwaves through the palace. Your credentials are no longer valid. Welcome to what insiders are already calling the most ruthless display of authority in the modern era of the monarchy. This was the dawn of the Windsor Purge. To the outside world, everything looked perfect. The cameras captured the polished stone of the castle and the elegant arrival of senior royals. But beneath that veneer of unity, a brutal realignment was unfolding. Reports suggest that Prince William personally reviewed the final guest registry only 2 hours before the ceremony began. For an event tied so closely to his aunt, Princess Anne, such an intervention was virtually unheard of. It was a breach of protocol that signaled a much deeper shift in the hierarchy. This was not a clerical error. It was a deliberate, surgical removal of influence. According to those within the administrative heart of the palace, the atmosphere shifted dramatically in the final moments leading up to the event. Staff members who usually moved with practiced ease were suddenly operating under a blanket of intense, suffocating scrutiny. Security personnel reportedly received updated instructions directly from senior aides connected to Kensington Palace, bypassing the traditional channels of the king's household. The names that vanished belonged to individuals who had grown increasingly prominent during King Charles's reign, figures who represented a blurring of the lines between the crown's institutional duty and the queen's private social network. The removals were quiet. There were no raised voices, no visible arguments in the velvet-lined corridors. That is the William way: efficiency over drama, power exercised through silence rather than shouting. Yet, the humiliation felt by those turned away was absolute. Imagine the scene. Individuals who believed they were at the very center of the royal fold, dressed in their finest attire, suddenly finding themselves treated like intruders at the gates of the very institution they thought they influenced. It was a message delivered with the weight of a falling axe. Whispers from royal aides suggest that the tension hanging over Windsor that afternoon was heavier than anything the family had experienced in 30 years. This was the moment the transition atmosphere became a reality. As King Charles continues his brave but exhausting struggle with his health, the vacuum of power is being filled. But it is not being filled by committee, and it is certainly not being filled by the Queen's social circle. It is being seized by the heir. The most explosive detail, however, is not just that these names were removed, but how it was done. Sources claim that Camilla herself was not informed of the changes until the very last moment. She reportedly learned the full extent of the situation only through frantic, hushed phone calls from her excluded friends as she prepared to take her place beside the king. The realization that her influence had been checked, right under her own roof, transformed the event from a celebration of tradition into a theater of cold, calculated power. Why would the Prince of Wales take such a drastic step? To understand the answer, we must look at what Princess Anne's gathering truly represented. It was never intended to be just another formal appearance. It was a consolidation of authority, a rallying cry for the old guard, and a rejection of the social maneuvers that have quietly expanded behind palace walls during the king's illness. William was not just editing a guest list, he was rewriting the rules of access for the future monarchy. As the doors to the Great Hall finally closed, leaving a trail of stunned socialites and confused aides in their wake, one truth became impossible to ignore. The era of compromise is over, The era of the Iron Protocol has begun. In this first chapter of our deep dive, we see the first strike in a battle for the soul of the crown, a battle where William has proven he is willing to be the architect of a new, disciplined order, even if it means humiliating those closest to the throne. Stay with us, because what happened next inside those closed doors, and the secret alliance William formed with Princess Anne to ensure this purge was successful, reveals a plan that has been in motion for months. This is only the beginning of the end for the old way of doing things. The prince has spoken, and his voice was heard through the silence of the deleted. The shock of the Windsor Purge was not merely the result of a single impulsive decision made in the heat of a moment. To understand why those names were deleted, one must understand the secret architecture of power that has been quietly rising behind the scenes for months. This was the public debut of a formidable new axis within the House of Windsor, an alliance between the heir to the throne and the hardest-working member of the royal family. In the corridors of the palace, they are now being referred to as the Old Guard, and their message is as clear as a winter morning. The crown is not a social club. For 21 days leading up to the ceremony, the communications between Kensington Palace and Gatcombe Park were frequent and intensely focused. These were not the typical exchanges between a nephew and an aunt regarding floral arrangements or seating protocol. According to those familiar with these private consultations, Prince William and Princess Anne were engaged in a strategic mapping of the monarchy's future. They were looking at the institution through a lens of absolute discipline, a philosophy inherited directly from the late Queen Elizabeth II. Princess Anne has spent 50 years as the ultimate defender of the royal structure. She is a woman who values hierarchy over headlines and duty over doting public affection. For her, the gradual blurring of lines during the early years of King Charles's reign had become a source of quiet but profound concern. She watched as social alliances and private introductions began to seep into the formal operations of the palace, creating what she reportedly described as a dilution of dignity. When William approached her with his concerns regarding the expanding influence of certain social circles, he didn't find just an ally. He found a mentor. This alliance is built on a shared belief that the monarchy survives only when it remains distinct, distant, and disciplined. As King Charles remains consumed by his ongoing health struggles, the responsibility of maintaining the sacred structure has fallen to those with the strength to uphold it. William, moving with the authority of a man already preparing for the weight of the crown, and Anne, the uncompromising guardian of tradition, decided that the Windsor event would be the place where the line was finally drawn. Insiders claim that the event was chosen with surgical precision. It was built around organizations and legacy institutions that were deeply precious to the late Queen. Within the House of Windsor, anything connected to the memory of Elizabeth II is considered holy ground. By choosing this specific gathering to execute the purge, William and Anne were making a symbolic statement. They were asserting that the late Queen's vision of duty, a vision where the institution always comes before personal interest, was being restored. Some senior staff members have even begun referring to that afternoon as the restoration moment. The planning was handled with the kind of secrecy usually reserved for state funerals or military operations. William reportedly held 3 private meetings with his senior team to review every single credential. He wasn't looking for enemies, he was looking for encroachment. He was identifying individuals whose presence served their own social standing more than it served the monarchy's mission. Every name that was eventually removed was flagged as a potential point of instability. While the public saw a polished royal engagement, the internal reality was that of a fortress being reinforced. Anne's role was crucial. By hosting the event, she provided the institutional cover. Her reputation for being unbothered by palace politics meant that no one suspected a radical move was coming. She remained the calm center of the storm, allowing William to act as the enforcer. This division of labor is what made the strike so effective. William provided the edge, while Anne provided the unshakable legitimacy. According to whispers from royal administrative circles, the Old Guard believes that the monarchy has entered a fragile chapter where uncertainty is the greatest enemy. In their view, the social network surrounding the Queen represented a variable they could no longer afford to ignore. They saw a network that valued access over service and visibility over validity. For William, The removal of those guests was a necessary amputation to save the health of the institutional body. There is a chilling detail that has begun to circulate among palace aides. During one of their final consultations, Anne reportedly told William that comfort is the enemy of the crown. It was a reminder that the monarchy does not exist to make people feel included in a social elite. It exists to represent a nation through a framework of duty. That shared conviction transformed the Windsor event into something far larger than a formal engagement. It became a manifesto written in the names that were no longer there. As the hour of the ceremony approached, the alliance between the prince and the princess royal stood as a wall of iron. They were no longer just family members. They were the joint architects of a new, colder reality. For 7 decades, Queen Elizabeth II had maintained the boundaries of the crown with a velvet glove. William and Anne have decided that in an era of such profound instability, the glove must come off. The old guard has risen, and they are not interested in social harmony or the feelings of the Parker Bowles circle. They are interested in the survival of the sovereign structure. As we move deeper into this story, we will see exactly how this alliance handled the fallout when the king himself realized that his sister and his son had seized the keys to the kingdom while he was looking the other way. The battle for the future of the monarchy was won at Windsor, not with a shout, but with a silent, coordinated, and devastatingly effective deletion. The prince and the princess had spoken, and for the first time in years, the palace felt like a fortress once again. For nearly 2 decades, the social architecture surrounding Queen Camilla had been constructed with the delicacy and persistence of a spider's web. It was an empire built not on constitutional law, but on something far more fluid and insidious: influence. Through a series of carefully managed dinner parties, private introductions, and strategic charitable appointments, a shadow court had begun to take shape within the heart of the monarchy. To the casual observer, it looked like harmless social networking. To Prince William, it looked like a lethal threat to the institutional integrity of the throne. The Windsor event was the moment this social empire met its Iron Chancellor. According to those who have watched the internal dynamics of the palace for 30 years, the tension between the Prince of Wales and the Queen's wider circle has been escalating in silence for quite some time. William, a man defined by a rigid sense of duty and an almost obsessive commitment to the business of monarchy, had grown increasingly uneasy with what he reportedly viewed as the Parker Bowles-ification of royal operations. He saw a growing number of individuals whose only credential was their proximity to the Queen, yet who were beginning to exert a subtle pressure on ceremonial planning and palace priorities. In William's cold, analytical view, social access is not and must never be sovereign authority. By the time the guest list for Princess Anne's gathering was being finalized, the Queen's social network believed they had achieved a status of untouchability. They expected prominent seating, enhanced visibility, and the continued validation of their proximity to the crown. They anticipated being the faces of the new reign, the modern social circle that would define the era of King Charles III. But they had fundamentally miscalculated the resolve of the man who was already looking 50 years into the future. The strike at Windsor was a clinical decapitation of this social influence. When William began the process of removing names, he was not just editing a registry, he was dismantling a power structure. Sources claim he targeted specific individuals who were seen as the gatekeepers of Camilla's social circle, those who leveraged their royal connections to build their own private empires of influence. By erasing their names from the Windsor event, William effectively stripped them of their most valuable currency, their perceived relevance. Imagine the psychological impact of that afternoon. For individuals who define their entire existence by their proximity to the throne, being turned away at a security checkpoint is a form of social execution. It is a signal to the rest of the elite that your stock has crashed. There is no greater humiliation in the world of the highborn than to discover that your access has been revoked by the very person who will one day hold the keys to the kingdom. This was the message William intended to send. It was a warning delivered with the sharpness of a guillotine. You may be the guests of the king's wife, but you are not the guests of the crown. Inside the palace, aides have whispered that William's approach was purely institutional. He reportedly refused to discuss the removals in personal terms. To him, this wasn't about a family disagreement or a dislike for his stepmother's friend. It was about defending the perimeter. He viewed the encroachment of this social circle as a blurring of institutional lines that made the monarchy look like a celebrity court rather than a sacred institution. The fallout from this social implosion has been devastating for those within Camilla's network. Reports suggest that in the 48 hours following the event, the private phone lines of the Queen's associates were buzzing with a mixture of panic and disbelief. Some felt they had been betrayed by the palace administration. Others, more astutely, realized they had been outmaneuvered by a future king who has no interest in social niceties or the preservation of a shadow court. For 7 decades, the monarchy had operated under the belief that personal friendships could be managed quietly in the background. But William has brought a new, more aggressive philosophy to the table. He believes that in an age of intense public scrutiny and institutional fragility, there can be no gray areas. You are either an official part of the royal mission, or you are an outsider. There is no middle ground. As the social empire of the Parker Bowles circle began to crumble under the weight of the Windsor Purge, the message to the Queen was unmistakable. She may hold the title, but the heir holds the pen. And that pen is currently busy striking out the names of anyone who believes they can manipulate the future of the crown through the back door of a social gathering. The Windsor strike has redefined the internal landscape of the palace. It has proven that while the king might reign, the prince is already ruling the administrative reality. And for the social climbers who thought they had secured a foothold in the future of the monarchy, the silence from William's office has been the most chilling fan quit of all. Their empire didn't fall with a bang. It vanished with a single, cold stroke of a pen. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Windsor Purge was not the humiliation of the guests, but the isolation of the king himself. Inside the gilded cage of the monarchy, there is no greater tragedy than a sovereign who becomes a spectator to his own reign. As the Windsor strike unfolded, King Charles III, a man who has spent 7 decades preparing for the weight of the crown, found himself caught in the middle of a silent, administrative coup led by his own son and his only sister. According to whispers from the highest levels of the palace, the king was informed of the guest list removals only 30 minutes after the operation had already been completed. Imagine the scene, a monarch battling a grueling health crisis, seeking a moment of stability and unity, only to realize that the fundamental mechanics of his household had been seized by the heir to the throne. It was a revelation that reportedly left Charles not just frustrated, but deeply, profoundly exhausted. For the past 12 months, the health of the king has been the central, unspoken anxiety of the House of Windsor. While the public sees a resilient figurehead, the internal reality is one of lethal struggles and a careful husbanding of limited energy. In this vacuum of vitality, a new phenomenon has emerged, something the palace staff now refers to as the transition atmosphere. This is not a formal policy, but a palpable shift in the air. It is the realization that the center of gravity has moved from the king's study to the prince's office. In this new atmosphere, the transition is no longer a future event. It is a current reality. William's decision to bypass his father on the Windsor registry was not born of disrespect, but of a cold, pragmatic assessment of the king's current capacity. To William, the king's illness had allowed certain social factions, specifically those connected to Queen Camilla, to gain an unhealthy foothold in royal operations. William reportedly believed that his father was too emotionally consumed by his recovery to notice how the institutional boundaries were being eroded. In the prince's mind, if the king could no longer guard the gates, the prince had a duty to lock them. This has placed Charles in an agonizing, almost impossible position. On one side stands Camilla, his strength and stay, the woman who has been his shield through 4 decades of public scrutiny. Her social circle represents his comfort and his private life. On the other side stands William, the personification of his legacy and the future of the Vung trio. By striking at Camilla's network, William has forced his father to choose between his personal happiness and his institutional responsibility. The emotional strain of this conflict has been visible to those who serve the king. Aides describe a monarch who is increasingly trapped between competing loyalties. Charles has always favored a philosophy of inclusion and harmony, a desire to keep the family together at any cost. But William and Anne have brought a different philosophy to the table: preservation through purity. They believe that for the monarchy to survive Charles's period of instability, it must return to a state of absolute, uncompromising discipline. The transition atmosphere has created a palace where communications are now siloed. Information no longer flows freely between the king's household and the prince's office. Instead, it is managed with a level of caution that borders on suspicion. The fact that the king was the last to know about the Windsor removals is the ultimate proof of this disconnect. It was a message to Charles as much as it was to Camilla. The operational control of the monarchy has passed to the next generation. Insiders claim that when Charles finally learned of the situation, the confrontation was not loud or explosive. There were no shouting matches in the halls of Windsor. Instead, there was a shattering silence. The king reportedly realized in that moment that he could not reverse what William had done without causing a public scandal that would further damage the crown. He was forced to accept a fait accompli, a finished reality. He had to stand there, smiling for the cameras, while knowing that his own authority had been quietly, surgically curtailed. This is the irony of the crown. Charles waited 70 years to lead, only to find that his leadership is being managed by a son who refuses to wait any longer. William is acting with the steel trap authority of a man who knows that the monarchy cannot afford a period of drift. If the king is too tired to be the great reformer, William will be the great enforcer. As we look at the king today, we see a man who is reigning, but perhaps no longer ruling. He has become a symbolic figure, while the Ver bin Kur and the future king handle the messy, brutal business of power. The Windsor incident was the moment the world caught a glimpse of this parallel monarchy. It showed a king who is being protected by his son in a way that looks very much like being controlled. For Camilla, the realization that her husband could not or would not protect her social circle from William's acts has been a bitter pill. It has exposed the limits of her influence and the cold reality of the royal hierarchy. The transition atmosphere is not just about the king's health, it is about the king's relevance. And in the wake of the Windsor Purge, that relevance has never looked more fragile. The prince has decided that the future starts today, and the present must simply learn to stay out of the way. This leads us to the most terrifying part of the story for those still inside the palace. If the king himself could not stop the purge, who can? The answer lies in the Iron Protocol, the new set of rules that has turned the palace into a fortress of discipline, and it is exactly what we will explore in the next chapter of this unfolding drama. The Windsor strike was not merely a singular event of exclusion, it was the unveiling of a new, permanent administrative reality. In the aftermath of that cold afternoon, a term began to circulate within the inner sanctum of the palace, whispered with a mixture of fear and respect: the Iron Protocol. This was no longer about a temporary disagreement or a singular guest list. This was the formalization of a new era of royal management, a system designed to ensure that the shadow court of the past 2 decades could never again threaten the institutional stability of the future. The Iron Protocol represents a radical departure from the inclusionary philosophy that had defined the early years of King Charles's reign. For 7 decades, the monarchy had survived by being adaptable, sometimes to a fault. But Prince William, supported by the uncompromising logic of Princess Anne, has decided that adaptability has become a liability. Under the Iron Protocol, the gray areas of royal life, those spaces where personal friendships and institutional duties overlap, have been scorched away. According to senior administrative staff, the protocol operates through a 2-tiered vetting system that is now applied to every single royal engagement, no matter how small. The first tier is institutional necessity. Does the individual's presence serve the direct mission of the crown? The second tier is public value. Does their attendance enhance the dignity of the institution in the eyes of the nation? If a potential guest fails to meet both criteria, They are deleted with the same surgical efficiency we witnessed at Windsor. This new system has effectively ended the era of social invitations. For years, the wider network of the Parker Bowles family and their associates had enjoyed what insiders called the invisible pass. They were the beneficiaries of a system based on favors and proximity. They could bypass traditional security routes. They could secure last-minute entries to restricted events. They could influence seating charts with a single phone call to the Queen's office. The Iron Protocol has terminated those privileges with cold precision. Reports suggest that the security arrangements at every royal residence have been overhauled to reflect this shift. Access routes that were once informal have been permanently closed. Security credentials that were once open-ended are now event-specific and subject to Kensington oversight. This means that even the closest relatives of the Queen now find themselves subject to the same rigid scrutiny as any other visitor. One palace aide described the change as moving from a family home to a high-security fortress. But the Iron Protocol is about more than just physical security. It is about administrative domination. The Prince of Wales has effectively created a parallel command that now eclipses the traditional household of the king. Every major decision regarding ceremonial planning, public positioning, and institutional priorities now flows through William's office. This was the mechanism that allowed the Windsor Purge to happen without the king's prior knowledge. By the time the guest list reached the king's desk, it had already been hardened by the Iron Protocol. Staff members who have served the monarchy for 3 decades describe the new atmosphere as controlled but explosive. There is a newfound clarity in the palace, but it is a clarity born of steel. William has made it clear that he is no longer interested in social harmony within the palace walls if it comes at the expense of institutional discipline. He is building a Vung trio for a new century, one that is leaner, more focused, and entirely free from the entanglements of the past. The psychological impact of the Iron Protocol on the Queen's household has been profound. For 1 decade, they were the rising power, the architects of a new, modern social monarchy. Now, they find themselves institutionally distanced. They are still present, still holding titles, but the mechanics of influence have been taken away from them. Every time a Parker Bowles associate is redirected at a checkpoint or finds their name under review for a ceremony, the message of the Iron Protocol is reinforced. This is the supreme judgment of Prince William. He has looked at the landscape of his future kingdom and decided that the old ways of influence peddling and social maneuvering are a rot that must be excised. With Princess Anne as his chief inspector, he is conducting a deep clean of the royal structure. They are restoring the ver bin cour philosophy, that the crown is a sacred trust, and those who serve it must be beyond reproach. There is a chilling efficiency to how the Iron Protocol handles confrontation. It doesn't engage in arguments. It doesn't offer clarification. If an individual attempts to challenge their exclusion, they are met with a wall of administrative silence. The protocol is designed to be self-executing. Once the decision is made, the machinery of the palace simply carries it out. This is what made the humiliation at Windsor so absolute. There was no one to complain to, no one to appeal to, and no one to blame but a system that had suddenly and permanently changed. As the Iron Protocol continues to expand its reach, the transition atmosphere has become a transition reality. William is no longer just the heir apparent, he is the operational sovereign. He has seized the administrative high ground, and from that position, he is reshaping the monarchy in his own image, an image of tête noire and bone firm. The Queen's social empire didn't just lose a few seats at a table at Windsor. It lost its right of access to the future. Under the Iron Protocol, the monarchy has become an exclusive institution once again, where the only currency that matters is service. The Parker Bowles era of influence is being systematically dismantled, name by name, checkpoint by checkpoint. And as we move into the final chapter of this story, we will see why the silence of the palace is the most terrifying fan quit of all. Because in the world of the Iron Protocol, if you are not essential, you are invisible. The prince has spoken, and the gates have been locked. There is no going back. What stunned royal watchers most in the days following the Windsor Purge was not the alleged removals themselves, but the absolute, suffocating silence that followed. In the world of high-stakes crisis management, there is a standard playbook. Denials are issued, corrections are leaked, and carefully crafted palace clarifications are sent to friendly journalists to soften the narrative. But this time, for the first time in 3 decades, the machinery of the palace remained motionless. There was no damage control. There was only an unmistakable, chilling stillness hanging over the crown. And within the rigid, ancient culture of the House of Windsor, silence is never an accident. Silence is a fonquiet. It is the ultimate confirmation that what occurred was not a mistake, but a choice. In the 72 hours after Princess Anne's event concluded, veteran royal correspondents reportedly waited for the usual off-the-record guidance that typically accompanies such internal friction. They expected to hear that it was a security misunderstanding or a technical glitch with the digital registry. But the guidance never came. Instead, senior aides who usually offer quiet context were suddenly unavailable. Phone calls went unanswered. The topic of the guest list became untouchable within the administrative corridors of both Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. This silence carried more weight than any public argument ever could. It signaled that Prince William was not interested in reinterpreting his actions. He was not looking for a way to save face for the Queen's social circle. By refusing to offer an explanation, the Prince of Wales effectively allowed the message of the purge to stand on its own. The boundaries have been reset, and they are non-negotiable. For many insiders, this was the moment the Kensington Doctrine became the law of the land. It is a philosophy that prioritizes the long-term survival of the institution over the short-term feelings of its members. William, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Princess Royal, has demonstrated that he is willing to endure a week of difficult headlines if it means securing the next 50 years of institutional discipline. The emotional undercurrents behind the scenes, however, tell a far more fractured story. While the public saw an image of polished royal unity, reports suggest that the Parker Bowles network has been left in a state of unprecedented panic. For individuals whose entire social and professional standing is built on their proximity to the throne, the realization that they can be erased in 5 minutes is terrifying. They have discovered that their alliance with the present king does not grant them immunity from the future sovereign. As the lights dimmed over Windsor that evening, one chilling question reportedly lingered inside the palace corridors. If a guest list can be rewritten this quietly, what else inside the monarchy is already changing in silence? The answer, it seems, is everything. We are witnessing a monarchy that is quietly reorganizing itself around the heir. It is a transition that is happening not through a formal ceremony, but through the iron protocol of administrative control. King Charles remains the monarch, but William has become the architect of reality. Every security decision, every restricted access route, and every deleted name is a brick in the wall he is building to protect the crown from what he views as internal dilution. Princess Anne's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. By providing the institutional legitimacy for William's strike, she has signaled to the old guard that the heir has her full confidence. Together, they have created an alliance that is effectively challenge-proof. Even the Queen, with all her years of carefully managed influence, has found that she cannot penetrate this wall of tête noire and bone fern. So, what does this mean for the future? Royal analysts now believe that the Windsor incident was merely the first move in a much larger deep clean of the royal household. As the king continues his focus on his health, we should expect to see more surgical removals. We should expect to see a monarchy that becomes smaller, more distant, and far more disciplined. The era of the social court is being buried under the weight of institutional necessity. For the viewers who have followed this deep dive into the shadows of Windsor, the lesson is clear. The House of Windsor is no longer a house divided. It is a house being reclaimed. William has proven that he possesses the Larn Lung required to lead in an era of uncertainty. He has shown that he values the sacred structure of his grandmother more than the social harmony of his father's reign. But one final mystery remains. As William prepares for a future that may arrive sooner than anyone expected, how will the Shadow Court respond? Will they retreat into the shadows, or will this humiliation trigger a new, even more dangerous chapter of internal conflict? Within the palace walls, they say that he who controls the gates controls the kingdom. At Windsor, William proved he has the keys. What do you think of Prince William's cold display of authority? Was it a necessary act of protection for the future of the crown? or was it a ruthless move that has caused unnecessary pain to his family? The Iron Protocol has been activated, and there is no turning back. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is the final piece of this royal puzzle. Thank you for joining us for this 6-part investigation into the secret revolution at Windsor. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the shifting power of the world's most famous family. The prince has spoken through his silence. The question is, are you ready for the era of the Iron King? We will see you in the next one.